try not to link into that. Do you want the Wi-Fi password set? Yeah, it's working. Just thinking about it. Still thinking about it.
Is the password working for you?
It didn't seem to. Yeah, it didn't seem to work for me either. Yeah, super missing 2018. Yeah, it didn't work. Oh well.
You'll sit at the front. Talk about how good the job the committee is doing. Yeah. And if you could, I mean, because you've got a bit more information than I think most, feel free to ask more detailed or comment on the bill, because what we're finding is these turn into information sessions, which is fine, but really we're needing that kind of feedback. Right now? Okay. Just for the recording. Is it amplified too? Oh.
I could hear it from. Oh yeah, I could hear it from moving the mic, moving the stand.
Well, I think I would love to go first, Jen. Yeah, please. Just black, Kevin. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. We're going to wait another 5 minutes, and then we'll start the formal part of the evening. But thank you very much for coming out, and we'll start talking in 5. have another mask? Do we have another microphone? Do we just have 2 mics? Yeah. Mr. LeBoy? Joey LeBoy? Thanks, Sonny. What would I do without you? Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations and Social Development to order. And before we begin, I first would like to thank you all for being here tonight and acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Gwich'in and Inuvik peoples. I'll now call on Joey LeBoy to lead us in an opening prayer. Mr. LeBoy, microphone. Thank you, Mr. LeBoy. And before we begin, we'll start by asking members to introduce themselves for the record. And we'll start with Mr. McNeely.
Thank you for coming out this evening here, ladies and gentlemen, and concerned citizens of Inuvik here. My name is Danny McNeely, and I'm the SA2 MLA, as well as a member to the Government Operations Committee. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Kevin O'Reilly, and I'm the MLA for Frame Lake, which is one of the ridings in Yellowknife. It's nice to be back in Inuvik, and I look forward to our discussion this evening. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Frederick Sonny Blake. Many of you may know me. I know a few in the crowd anyway. But I'm the MLA for the Mackenzie Delta, which is Zigachik, Fort McPherson, and McClavick. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for having us here. We had a good meeting with the leadership today, and my name is Herdnakamak. I'm MLA for Nunukput.
Thank you, members, and I'm Kieron Testart, member for Cam Lake, which is the Yellowknife riding, and chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. We also have Mr. Lee Selleck, who is our research advisor from the Legislative Assembly staff, and Ms. Jennifer Franki-Smith, who is our committee clerk, and she keeps the ship upright. And today we are also joined by Chris Cartwright. He is from Public Affairs, and this hearing is broadcast live on social media. So thank you to all those who are watching us at home or from the comfort of their electronic devices. Now, before we begin the formal hearing, we have an agenda before us. Committee, can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Mr. Blake, there's a motion on the floor. All those in favor? Thank you, committee. The agenda is adopted. Declarations of conflict of interest. Hearing none, we'll move on to our item of business today, public hearing on Bill 6, Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Implementation Act. And before we begin to hear from the public, I just have a few opening comments. And if you'll bear with me, it gives a bit of substance and background to the bill itself to help us better focus our discussions this evening. In April of 2017, the federal government introduced two bills to legalize cannabis in Canada. Bill C-45 deals with federal licensing and oversight of the cannabis supply chain. The bill also sets out regulatory standards to protect public health and safety. This means that the federal government will manage all cannabis production and distribution, including medical cannabis. Offenses and procedures relating to impaired driving are set out in Bill C-46. Right now, we assume that these bills will be passed on June 7th. When that happens and the Government of Canada legalizes cannabis across the country, the Northwest Territories will need local rules for cannabis control, including rules for the use, sale, and transportation of cannabis, rules for youth, and rules for smoking in public places. To create these rules, which will pick up where the federal legislation leaves off, the Government of the Northwest Territories has introduced Bill 6, the Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Implementation Act. Bill 6 proposes two new laws for cannabis control, the Cannabis Products Act and the Cannabis Smoking Control Act. It also proposes amendments to current laws on impaired driving found in the Territorial Motor Vehicles Act to address drug-impaired driving. We know that many Northerners have already shared their views with the GNWT in its community engagement last year. This committee understands that the government incorporated that feedback into Bill 6. Then once the bill was introduced into the Legislative Assembly, it was referred to the standing committees so we could do our own thorough review, which brings us to your community today. The bill touches on many different areas, from cannabis control to road safety, and that means that it touches on the jobs of multiple standing committees. To that end, both the Standing Committee on Government Operations and the Standing Committee on Social Development are traveling together to coordinate our review of the bill. In fact, our colleagues are also holding public hearings today in Hay River. Together, our role as legislators is to look at how this bill might be improved, to find questions that need to be answered, and to hear from the public. That's why we're here today. Copies of the bill are available at the back of the room at the table over there, along with some additional written information that may be helpful in tonight's discussions. It's important to keep in mind that neither this committee nor the Government of the Northwest Territories can change or overrule the federal legislation. Cannabis will be legalized once the federal legislation has passed. However, the Northwest Territories does have authority over some important decisions. We've prepared a handout that shows where the Northwest Territories has jurisdiction, and that's what we'd like to hear your thoughts on today. For example, the bill proposes a minimum age of 19 years for cannabis possession, consistent with current liquor laws. The bill also proposes options for community plebiscites on cannabis control, but with some restrictions, and zero tolerance for drug impairment in novice drivers, drivers 21 and under, and commercial drivers. You'll see that the bill also talks about rules for cannabis production and sales in our territory, rules for smoking cannabis in public places, guidelines for signs in cannabis stores, and rules for young people. We also expect that many Northerners will be interested in talking about the government's proposal to limit sales to existing liquor stores. If you'd like to share your views with us today, please let the clerk know by raising your hand. The clerk will be sure to put you on our witness list, and we will also, and then you can take the mic, and you'll have 5 minutes to speak to the committee, and then we'll do our best to answer your questions if required, or ask additional questions of you if we need clarification on the comments that you're providing to us. Don't worry, if you use up your 5 minutes, you can get back on the list and go again, but we want to make sure everyone has an opportunity to speak tonight. We also will accept written submissions by post or by email until Friday of this week, May 4th at 5 p.m. If you'd like to send us something in writing, please ask the clerk for our mailing information, and we'll make sure your written submission gets to the committee for full consideration. And one final piece of housekeeping, please remember that all submissions will be part of the official committee records and it may be reflected in our final report. Any submissions made during this meeting may also be televised or broadcast via social media. Thank you, everyone, for your patience in allowing this lengthy introduction. With members' agreement, we can now open the floor. Do members agree? Thank you, members. Is there anyone from the general public who would like to comment on Bill 6 at this time? Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Hood. If you could just introduce yourself and then proceed with any comments you have.
Certainly. My name is Grant Hood. I'm the Senior Administrative Officer for the town of Inuvik. I have one question, sort of a clarification. And pardon me, I'll be sort of working backwards within the Cannabis Products Act and the sections. So under Section 14, it says that if a cannabis store operates in the community, no question may be asked in a plebiscite initiated under Section 13 that would allow you to prohibit it. So from that, I understand that once there is a cannabis store open in the community, we cannot have a plebiscite to say, no, we don't want it. So then going back in under Section 6, it says, though, that before designated a vendor, in other words, before it's done, it says that the minister shall ascertain the views of that community and give notice, and it outlines the things. My question is, why would they not do it if they're going to get a application to put in a store in a community, that the minister wouldn't just go ahead and do the plebiscite that the community would not have the option right there to ask for a plebiscite, and just how other ways would they get the views of the community?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I'll just take this opportunity to let everyone know that this committee is not proposing this legislation. We are in the process of reviewing it, so there may be some questions you have that we cannot answer at this time. You're quite correct in your assessment of the current form of the legislation that lays out a process where if a cannabis store comes into effect, notice must be given to a local community, and at that point, the minister is required by law to consult the views of that community, and that is when the option for a plebiscite would come forward. So that's currently what is established under the bill. My understanding and committee's understanding at this point is that this is very much mirrored to resemble the current form of the Liquor Act as well. And of course, plebiscites are possible under the Liquor Act, and they follow a similar process. So the government has mirrored that legislation and modeled it for their cannabis regime as well. Whether or not it needs to be mirrored, that is up for debate, and it sounds like your comments are speaking to a greater level of engagement prior to the licensing application even coming forward. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit more?
Thank you for that opportunity. I just believe that if they're allowing a community that doesn't have a store all of a sudden to have the plebiscite, that the government should be looking at anytime the opportunity should be there if they want to put the store in to do the plebiscite, not just try and do the views, because the views could be of a minority and not of the majority, depending on, because sometimes the vocal, you may hear the minority and not the majority, that kind of a thing. So I believe that that opportunity, that's the best way to do it, because the mechanism is already there to request a plebiscite, so why not? I think the government should look at amending it to allow for the plebiscite to get. That's one way they can get the view.
So a plebiscite prior to, rather than a reactive plebiscite.
Well, if they give notice, then if they give notice to the community that there's been an application to have a cannabis store put into the municipality, then the council or whatever would have that opportunity then to request a plebiscite right there and then. And I'm not too sure if that's really right in the regulations over in the other section or not. So that would be that the community would have an option to request a plebiscite right there to get that view before it's granted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hood. You still have some time on the clock. Did you have another topic you'd like to discuss? Feel free.
The other question, I guess, is just more on a health and safety. Is there anything designed or anything the government hasn't put anything about impairment and that? Now, I understand somewhere in the federal legislation there may be something. Is the government, for example, going to be looking at the WSCC regulations in the Northwest Territories to maybe put something in there, or some kind of that to also or look at what the levels that the federal government is looking at? I understand we can possibly change them, although I believe it might be a criminal code, so maybe difficult. That. And the other thing is, from a more personal, not a personal thing, but on the Inuvik, the revenues that come in for this, obviously there's a cost of enforcement. I would ask this committee to recommend that any of the extra money go towards the infrastructure deficit that all
And that's your time. Thank you. I'll do my best to answer your first question, and then I'll allow committee members to speak to your submission. So you're quite correct in that the federal government has established some limits for impairment. They're proposed limits at this point until the legislation is finalized. I won't get into the specifics of it because it isn't the material that we're considering tonight, but sufficient to say it prohibits a certain amount of THC, which is the psychoactive component of cannabis in the bloodstream, towards a certain measurement in nanograms. And the science is beyond me, I'll confess, but that is a matter for the criminal code, which is, of course, outside of territorial jurisdiction. As to work sites, the WSCC, Worker Safety Compensation Commission, legislation and policies already have a zero tolerance for impairment of the workplace. And this committee has met with a representative from the WSCC last week, about a week and a half ago, and they have informed us that they are working on updating their policies and procedures to address cannabis once it becomes legal, and they will be working with employers and the government to ensure that those are within scope of the legislation and address this concern that we as members have heard from many employers, that they are concerned about legal cannabis affecting the work site. But you'll note that Bill 6 does not address amendments to WSCC because the WSCC legislation is very clear that you cannot be impaired at work, and that does not change. Currently, it doesn't matter if it's alcohol or a prohibited drug. Impairment is impairment, and the criminal code is similar as it relates to driving. The changes we're looking at in this legislation are about strengthening the penalties for impairment and a few of the procedures that go along with impairment. And thank you for your recommendation. Committee notes it. And now I'll turn to committee members if they'd like to speak to your comments.
Thanks, Mr. Hood, for your questions, and I can assure you that we've been asking some of the same questions of the cabinet ministers and their officials when we started our review of the bill. I just want to turn back to I think it was your first question about community control, and the way the bill seems to be set up, there's almost like two independent processes where the community can decide whether they want to have an unrestricted system of access to cannabis, or they can have what's called a restricted system, where the quantity or type of cannabis that persons may possess, purchase, transport, or bring into the community is limited in some way, or they can have an outright prohibition. So that's one track, and communities have the ability to decide which track they want to go on. The way that they do that is the municipal council or bank council passes a resolution that they want one of those systems, and then it's up to the minister, who has discretion to decide whether a plebiscite will be held in that community. So that's sort of one stream or one process. The other process is where the ministers decided that there's going to be a vendor in a cannabis store in a community that doesn't have a cannabis store already, that the minister is obligated to consult with the community. And that, from what we understand, may happen fairly quickly. As we understand it, the cabinet's plan is to use the liquor stores as the point of sale for cannabis, so that the places that have liquor stores like Inuvik, Hay River, Yellowknife, Norman Wells, Fort Simpson, and Hay River, those places will be the liquor stores that operate in those places. They'll be asked whether they want to sell cannabis as well. It'll have to be physically separated in some way, but those will be the first points of sale in the Northwest Territories once the legislation is approved, and if it goes through in its Is this one? That's better. Sorry. So, as we understand it, the plan is to sell cannabis through the liquor stores. There's liquor stores now in Inuvik, Norman Wells, Fort Simpson, Yellowknife, Hay River, and Fort Smith. So they'll have to have a separate entrance and be physically separated, but and the operators of the liquor stores are not obligated to sell cannabis, but they're going to be offered the opportunity to sell it. But even for those communities that have liquor stores and that the owner wants to sell cannabis, the minister still has to consult with the community government and take those views into consideration before allowing for the cannabis store to be opened. Doesn't mean that he or she is going to not open it, just means they have to take that into consideration. But so there's two separate processes there. I'm not sure that explains it really clearly, but I've done the best I can to try to explain that part of the Act.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll direct my reply to the last question you had. and that's on the enforcement side and the impairment side. I think the community has to realize that these resources, we've always said, are going to be redirected back into the education and ongoing of cannabis. And as we sit here tonight, and we mentioned to some of our previous communities, we don't expect the audience or the community leadership to know everything about Bill 6. It's going to take several meetings, several workshops to understand the administration of this new legislation, as well as the health factors and the public facilities, such as the schools. There's quite a bit of concerns on the schools with the youth. So I think a lot of that money could be directed to those types of workshops. But as far as the policing of this, I think the community has to identify, okay, we want to police and enforce this system. So it really is leaving the option up to the community to identify how they want to best utilize the resources created by the sales of cannabis. Once that system is identified by the community, it could be directed to the minister. Thank you.
Mr. Blake?
Thank you, Mr. Hood. Just under the profits, I'll just touch on that a bit. The department's not sure what the sales will be, but just to give you an example, for alcohol, it's roughly 25 million per year that the GNWT makes, and the department doesn't feel that it'll even match that, but who knows? But even at say 10% of that profit is roughly 2.5 million, so it's really not going to be as much profit as we may think that's going to happen. Or that's just what the department's told us, but anything can happen. But for sure we'll take those notes, and we'd like to see more money put into. It also came up too in the communities that we put more money into education and health, because we don't know the health impacts this will have as well. But
we can kind of grasp it a little bit better, more at the grassroots level, so that we can look at making possibly better improvements to this. Earlier on, it was mentioned plugging the holes, but I think it's going to take more than that to make something like this float and work. The revenues, enforcement, the communities don't have the capacity to enforce something like this at the municipal level. And look at the stresses that it's going to put on the number of RCMPs that are in each community as well, too. I think we have to look at that as a whole, not just one area. I think we're going to have to improve everything so that it actually works better together. Otherwise, if somebody drops the ball somewhere, it's going to have a snowball effect on how it affects people. And usually it affects the people who don't really have a voice, where some councillors in other places, they may have a little bit more clout. I can get back, I don't know, this might spark up some conversations on health and well-being in the communities around the region, maybe even the territory and beyond. Thanks.
Thank you, members, and we'll go to the next person who'd like to speak to the committee. Don't be shy. Okay, one thing that we have found helpful. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please come.
Hi there, I'm Ruth Wright, and I live right here in Inuvik. There's quite a few things people asked me to talk about when I came to this meeting. It's like, and they're all too shy to come up and say anything, but I'll try my best. They wanted to ask about the money from selling cannabis products. And what will it be used for? I think it should go right back into treating the people that are using it and education for the younger people. There are kids 12 years old and younger using it right here in Inuvik. And is the federal government going to kick in and top off the NWT implementation of the new legal criminal stuff that's going to be happening? All that sort of stuff needs to be written down in ink. Sounding good. And then there's so many people who are affected by, and another thing, all the stuff that you're worrying about driving under the influence and walking down the street smoking up and all this sort of stuff should be the same as drinking. I mean, goodness, you're not allowed to go drinking alcohol and walking down the street. Same thing with marijuana. They shouldn't be going down the street smoking up. Crying out loud. I'd get mad at them. They'd hear from me. But it's affecting a lot of people, kids, children, whether the parents are doing it in front of the kids, whether they're doing it at home and spending all their money on it. There's just a lot of things going on. That's just a few of the things they asked me to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. We've heard this question about revenue quite a lot, and as members have said, we don't know what the government's intentions are. It has been raised at committee in public about whether or not cannabis revenues could be redirected towards public health, and the Minister of Justice was not willing to make that commitment. So at this point, the government's proposal is that all cannabis revenues will go into general revenue and become part of the resources available for all government spending and not targeted at a specific public need, such as health, such as education. We as a committee have asked for and as regular members have asked to see a spending plan for cannabis implementation and public education. And that has not been prepared publicly yet. And we're still waiting for the government to do that. They have committed to bring forward a spending plan after or concurrent with this bill as it makes its way through the Legislative Assembly. And I expect once that spending proposal comes forward, there'll be some lively public debate on where the resources are going and whether or not communities have the support they need to manage the enforcement responsibilities under the bill and the public health outcomes that people are rightfully concerned about with this new product. The federal government has entered into a revenue sharing deal with the provinces and territories. The taxation on cannabis will be what's called an excise tax, and 75% of that tax will go to the provinces and territories, with the remaining 25% being retained by the federal government. And the federal government, however, has made a commitment to spend that 25% of revenues on public health. But we have yet to see how that works because the bill hasn't passed yet on their end either. But they have made that commitment. They have a very generous revenue sharing deal with the territories as well, so it won't impact our available resources that they otherwise provide to us through our transfer agreements and funding agreements. So we'll be able to retain cannabis revenues for whatever purpose we see fit. But we have heard this concern about the need for funding public health and redirecting revenues towards public health and education. And as for public consumption, the Bill 6, the component of the bill that speaks to smoking control, the Cannabis Smoking Act, addresses many of your concerns. I think a lot of people, when thinking about cannabis, assumed that the public smoking would look more like tobacco. But the bill is very restrictive on where you can smoke. You cannot consume cannabis, or smoke cannabis rather, in a public park, in a playground, near a school, near a health center, near any really any facility that the public has access to. So it's quite restrictive on where cannabis can be consumed. Although there are no restrictions for privately owned property, as long as it's not a business or something like that, there are restrictions placed on it like that. So I think you'll find that some of your concerns are addressed in the current form of the legislation. The real question is, how do you enforce the prohibition on public smoking? And that requires a conversation about resources. And I know many of you are thinking about that. The conversation we had with leaders was very similar to that this afternoon. And unfortunately, we don't have those answers because it will be up to the government to bring forward some resources of their own to enforce the public smoking sections of the bill. And we have noted your suggestions for where revenue should be going from cannabis sales. Okay, thank you again, Ms. Wright. Does anyone else like to speak?
Hi, my name is Crystal Lenny, and I'm from Inuvik here, and I've just got a couple of questions regarding the legislation, and I was just looking on drug-induced psychosis, because I know from personal experience the effects of cannabis on the teenage brain, and I was looking in Psychology Today, and it talks about an article in April 2014 about, it says, whether or not you believe recreational marijuana should be legal, it's time to admit its power as a dangerous addictive drug. So, and we've already gone through that, but I've got a question in section 33. It says that youth would be allowed to go into a cannabis store with their parents. I don't think that, I'm part of my ignorance, but I don't know if they're allowed to go into a liquor store. So I don't think that they should be, in order to protect youth, I think they shouldn't be allowed to go. I think that the fines regarding youth are like a slap on the wrist, and I think that a study should be done in relation to the health system and how much does it cost for marijuana on a teenage brain? How much does it cost the system to treat drug-induced psychosis and things like that? Prior to having slap on the wrist fines, I think they should be doubled. I think that youth should be counseled to avoid the use of it. And I think that all the fines at least need to be doubled or if not tripled in the Northwest Territories.
Thank you, Ms. Lenny. So just a point of clarification, there are two issues for youth as it relates to legal cannabis. One is when it is not illegal and it is still a charge under the criminal code, which is covered by the federal legislation. And if a young person is in possession of cannabis over 5 grams, then they can be subject to criminal prosecution under the that would fall under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. So that is the limit for young people. If it's under 5 grams, there are no criminal prosecutions, but this legislation proposes a fine, as you pointed out, and confiscation of the cannabis product, and potentially that parents are informed. So similar to punishment under the Liquor Act. But I did want to just make it clear that there is a limit where the court system does come into effect for young people, and that is over 5 grams. Whereas adults or those over the age of 19, as proposed by this legislation, we have a personal limit of 30 grams that they can carry on their person, and 4 plants that they can have at home. So those are the adult limits versus the youth limits. Right. Oh, those penalties. Okay, I understand now. Yes, so the bill does establish fines and steep ones for. Yeah. So there are fines established under the legislation for selling to underage persons, and to either through a cannabis store or through someone, a private individual. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Did anyone have any comments for Ms. Lenny? Okay. Thank you, Ms. Lenny. Sir, did you want to? I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but.
Good evening. Thank you for making a trip to our community to talk to us here. My name is Steve Barlock. I'm a resident here since birth, and I guess also I'm the deputy mayor at the moment as well. So. I would just start off noticing one little bit of contradiction in the handout you guys have here. In some of the bullet points you have, it talks about possession and sales and set minimum age for cannabis purchase, use, and possession is at 19 years. But then a few columns over for rules for youth, it says youth 19 years and under can't buy or possess cannabis. So you've made a contradictory statement there that on one hand they can, and then in the next bullet they can't. When they're for a 19-year-old, because it's 19 years and under. So that includes a 19-year-old. And the bullet under that as well, under rules for youth, youth 19 years and under must be supervised in cannabis stores. So if you go to something like the liquor store, for example, someone who is of age 19 does not need to be accompanied by an adult to walk around in the store to purchase. They're of the legal age at that point in time. So it just seems odd that there's two contradictory bullets. There's one saying you can purchase, use, and possess at 19, and the other one says you can't. So you may want to tighten that up.
I'll just speak to that quickly. Thank you. You pointed out an error in our information, but the age to consume cannabis legally would be 19, just to match alcohol as well. So that should be
under 19.
Under 19, yeah, that's correct. But just for clarification, it's under 19. That's what the legislation proposes. And you may continue.
Thanks. So, I've been thinking about this a bit as well. I'm not a user, never have been, don't plan to be after it's decriminalized. But one of the key things I have a concern about, and from a leadership perspective too, is obviously the public safety aspect, which you guys have mentioned, you've heard a lot about, particularly the operation of motor vehicles and things like that. That's going to be a key factor in making sure that our communities remain safe and that we do have the appropriate mechanisms in place to find out when people are using, when they're driving under the influence, and that there's appropriate penalties attached to that. I assume the enforcement with that will rely largely on the RCMP, as it does for Liquor Act violation, driving under the influence of alcohol. But in regards to things like people consuming in public areas and the enforcement on the GNWT level for some of those things in public spaces, my understanding there as well is that it's being put to the environmental health officers to enforce that. I see a bit of a problem with that myself because, as far as I'm aware, there's only a handful of them across the whole territory. For 33 communities, I believe there's only 5 or 6 environmental health officers for the whole territory. So it's all well and good that you can put in all the rules in place you want, but if you don't have the mechanisms and the resources and the capacity to actually enforce any of the rules, then what's to stop people from breaking them at any time they feel like it? So that issue of capacity and the ability to enforce is going to be critical in carrying this forward, and where that lies, I guess, is a matter for discussion. So I guess one of the other, it's a bit of a joke in some of the municipal meetings, but I guess the Inuvik Association of Communities meeting, which I was not actually at, but we heard afterwards that there was a question at that point about in relation to the 10 feet or 3 meter smoking zones around entryways into businesses or non-smoking areas, and whether there's ever been a fine levied for a contravention of that rule, and nobody could think of one in the 10 plus years or 15 years it's been in place. So you're going to be facing a similar situation with the cannabis legislation and relying on environmental health to deal with that. There's just not the capacity or the resources to do it. And again, if there's certain areas where there's private properties or businesses that allow that type of activity within those designated areas, and people are contravening that, who's going to enforce that? Are they going to be leaning on something, for example, the bylaw officers in the communities to deal with that? And do we have the capacity as a community to have our officers taking on that role? And there may not be a desire to do it. It's still something to be discussed in our community, but for a lot of communities, they may not actually want their bylaw officers to have that ability. And I can't see the RCMP having a whole lot of interest in enforcing those rules as well. So I think you can count them out with respect to some of those types of rules. So relying on or regulating the sale through the Liquor Commission, I guess I don't fully understand the logic behind that in the sense where, for the people who do want to access it, there may be people in the communities, particularly ones who do not have an existing liquor store, to look at this as an economic and entrepreneurial opportunity for themselves. There may even be organizations that want to take it on and have some more level of control within their own community as far as how it's being distributed in the community, how people are accessing it, and quality control, whatever people want to do. So I don't quite understand the rationale behind restricting it to the Liquor Commission off the start. Maybe that'll change in the future at some point. But looking at it purely from an economic standpoint, regardless of anything else, it seems to be taking away opportunities from people and residents and businesses in the territory in a time of hard economic times. So whether there may be changes to that in the future, we'll see. Because I know from a little bit of stuff that I heard when, for example, Colorado decriminalized in their state, there was talking about some of the stores that existed beforehand who were making, say $20,000 a month in sales, and then when it became decriminalized, right away their sales were over $200,000 a month for the increase in consumption for people going there, because they're also getting not only people within the state and existing users, but they're getting people from outside, since they were one of the first out the gate in the U.S. to decriminalize. So again, not something I'm interested in pursuing, but there may be other people out there who see this as a real economic opportunity for the entrepreneurial spirit and to get out there and to try to do something in their community for themselves. And as an organization that may want to take it on, may be able to do something for their members as well with some of the resources that might get out of it. So those are just a few of my rambling thoughts at the moment. So it's not something that I have spent a lot of time on, because again, it's nothing personal consequence to me or my family, but it is something as a community leader I have to think about and try to figure out how we in this community are going to address it. And I think the feelings are pretty mixed in the community about what people are for or against it or on the fence. So I think the option to have that plebiscite, even in a community like Inuvik, which has an existing liquor store, if we want to pursue that option, I think is a good one to really get a good handle on what the sentiment is around the majority of the community, because I don't know if I fully understand it myself. I hear different things here and there, but I have not heard from the majority of the people here. So, yeah, thank you for the time. Thank you for coming. Hopefully we'll get 3 more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barlock, and that's pretty good for someone put on the spot. I appreciate we've also heard a lot about this issue of economic opportunity in communities that choose that want to see it as an economic opportunity. And of course, the legislation as written does allow the minister to designate a cannabis store, but the government has been very clear that they do not plan to do that anytime soon. But there may be ways to affect the legislation, so that's, as it's currently written, to represent more economic opportunities. So that is part of the process we are undertaking as a committee, to hear from you, from all of you, in as many of these meetings that we can do, and to see how those viewpoints can be turned into legislative amendments, or at least recommendments to government if they can't actually work to change the bill. So we are looking at all of these concerns, and I think at the end of the day, the priority is making sure communities have the choice, can choose for themselves about how they want cannabis to work, and to ensure the North can control cannabis effectively, because ultimately this was initiated by the federal government, and now it's our responsibility as legislators to ensure that we have rules in place to control cannabis in the Northwest Territories. But thank you very much for your comments. Members? Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Barlock and Ms. Lenny and Ms. Wright. I want to thank you for sharing your views. The more we get brought to our attention, whether it's similar in other communities, the more we can incorporate those concerns in our report. And if there are majority common concerns in several communities, it just means a majority of interest are in that particular issue, on education, say, for example. So it means that we need more resources to hold more workshops so everybody's aware of the health implications to cannabis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Barlock. Just under the enforcement part, under the RCMP, I know it's been a concern from bylaws in some of the communities. Seems like a little more onus is going to be put on them to enforce these rules, because we'll use Sigachik for an example. We don't have RCMP, we don't have an environmental health officer, so all we have is a bylaw, and basically they're going to be stuck enforcing a lot of these laws here. And as you know, communities are struggling already with the funding that they have, so there's a lot that needs to be done, and these are the early stages of this law, but within the first year for sure we're going to see exactly how much this is going to cost the communities and our government, and for sure the federal government's going to kick in more because they're the ones that are forcing this upon us. And I know it's been a concern for a number of other communities that have raised this, both as myself and with committee. And the other thing was, there's under the economic opportunities, it's come up quite a bit in Yellowknife. People are bringing it forward to their MLAs, and I believe that concern is brought up here under their public consultation. I didn't attend, but from what I understand, people see the opportunity there, but I'm sure, like anything else, we'll see changes, I'm sure, further down the road, but just because we're given such a short timeline, I'm sure the department felt it as more simpler just to use the liquor stores, and so that's what we're seeing right now. And, but I'm sure we'll see changes in the near future. But those are the marching orders that are given so far, and it's kind of tough for us to kind of commit to anything, because basically we have to go with what the department's been telling us, and it's pretty tough for us to make commitments on behalf of the minister and their department. So we kind of have to watch how we answer your questions. Because basically what we're here to do is listen to the community, to hear your concerns and comments, and it's all being recorded, and at the end of the day we're compiling everything that's said throughout all the communities to do our report, which we'll be tabling the end of May. And we explained this little further. A couple of communities said, "Well, how are you forcing this upon us?" We're put in a difficult position because it seems like we're the ones that are bringing this forward, but actually it's federal government. Cabinet is the one that designed a lot of this, and at the end of the day we're going to have to vote on this, and if for some reason we all voted against it, that'll just open up. There'll be basically almost no rules to follow in the NWT. So, we're kind of being put in a good spot here to approve this. That way we could make changes in the years to come. And just thought I'd add that. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm just kind of following up on Sonny's, what Sonny was saying earlier. Maybe what this could help the regions do is, like us as regular MLAs and as members of certain committees, we could be the liaison between the communities and cabinet as we get to session on May 24th. I know that gives you a little bit of time for input, and as well as to help committees help drive the way the legislation is going. And as well, for regions like here, I know in the Inuvik region, in my region, in that there are 4 small communities that have a direct relationship with the federal government. I see the mayor of Inuvik here, and other. This is an idea for other leaders like yourselves to lobby directly with the federal government. This may give it more clout and more drive, and as well give a face to the funding needed in the regions to help with some of the issues. Then as well, some of the communities, I see Sonny was talking about plebiscites, and also this will give a clear direction of how to start the process for communities that maybe don't have the capacity or are just building it. I know the municipalities are the ones that will be, I wouldn't say caught off guard, but more left behind when this kind of hits the ground. So I think being aware of all those steps, all those processes, I think we need to kind of help each region build that capacity in every aspect. Within the departments that we have in the respective communities. And I know Inuvik being a regional center, it has the opportunity to actually really grow and help create more jobs and create capacity at the level here, and as well as outlying communities in the region.
Thank you, members. So I just want to talk a bit more about the contents of the bill, because that might help encourage some more discussion around what's specifically being proposed. And we've heard a few of the details, but we have actually prepared a handout at the back of the room. It looks like this, and it's double-sided. And one side has the 3 responsible governments for this legislation: the Government of Canada, and it lays out the Government of Canada's roles and responsibilities and powers, the Government of the Northwest Territories, and then municipal and community governments. So any of the options you see listed under municipal and community governments are enabled by this Bill 6 legislation, and so they don't exist until the legislation passes, if it passes in its current form. On the other side, you will see a column that just talks about why we're talking about Bill 6, what this committee can do with Bill 6, and contact information for the committee. And then there are 4 columns about what rules are being proposed in Bill 6. So I'll just walk us through those right now. The first section is possession and sales. So the minimum age will be established for cannabis purchase, use, and possession at 19. Match federal possession limits of 30 grams per person and 4 plants per household. And that's 30 grams that you can carry in public. You can possess as much cannabis at home as you like under what's being proposed with Bill 6. It's just the amount you can carry out of the store and carry on yourself in public. Distribution and sales, including mail order through the Liquor Commission and existing liquor stores. Community control, option to hold a plebiscite on cannabis restriction or prohibition if there's no local store selling cannabis. Option to request temporary prohibition orders or short-term bans if there is no local store selling cannabis. And the bill proposes to create an advisory committee to give advice to the government on cannabis regulation. One of the areas of cannabis regulation that still is not legal is edible products. So that's something that may be coming in the future, and that would be where you would bring up a cannabis advisory committee. Drug impaired driving, there will be 0 tolerance for novice drivers, drivers 21 and under, and for commercial drivers.
and administrative license suspensions for impaired cases. Smoking control. Smoking will be permitted on private property, prohibited in specific public spaces, including school grounds, health facilities, and outdoor bus shelters. And there'll be an option, the bill allows for an option to request special occasion permits, so short-time permission for an otherwise banned area. And under rules for youth, so just to clarify, this is youth 18 and under, can't possess, buy, or use cannabis. They cannot enter a cannabis store without the supervision of an adult. And there will be zero tolerance for drug impairment in drivers 21 and under. So the penalties are quite steep for young people, 21 and under. Higher fines for people selling or giving cannabis to youth under 19 years. And release of driving records to enforcement on request. So that's a new feature of the legislation that will allow law enforcement agencies to receive access to driving records, and that's currently not allowed under the Motor Vehicles Act. And I'll just talk briefly about what this committee can do. So although, again, we did not design this legislation, part of the legislative process is to review any of the legislation that moves its way through the Legislative Assembly. This bill is currently in what we call the committee stage, and at this time, committees have 120 days to review legislation and to do things like this community consultation, to do our own research, ask our own questions, and then to report back on the bill. And we can either do that by saying it's ready to go, sign it, let's go, let's vote on it, or we can issue a report that has detailed commentary on what we heard and what we'd like the government to do, or we can propose amendments, and amendments actually change the laws and will ultimately affect the final product. So we do have powers here. They're limited to the contents of the bill, but if it's something like changing the age from 19 to 21 or 16, as long as it's within the federal guidelines of that they've established with their legislation, this committee could move an amendment, and it may or may not carry. But so we do have ability to modify the legislation. I just wanted to make it clear to people that your comments can result in those kind of changes, and we will be communicating with members of the public once we have decided on how we want to proceed with this legislation. And of course, we have another group in the South who are doing these consultations as well, and we'll come together and see the final shape, or if we want to change the bill at the end of this week, actually. Yes? Sure. Do you mind coming forward?
Hi, it's Ruth Wright again. Has the federal government developed any testing for using, such as breathalyzer test, the fingerprint, mouth swabs like in DNA and stuff like that? Smoking in vehicles is quote unquote illegal for anybody with kids. Is the same thing going to happen with marijuana? Or if I can smell it waltzing by your vehicle and there's kids in there, is that enough proof that they've been in there? You know, and grams, like not all of us are cannabis users. How much is that? Is it 3 joints, 1 sandwich, bakey, 2 brownies? What? I don't know.
Thank you, Ms. Wright. So luckily I can answer some of your questions. So 30 grams is about 60 cigarettes. Yeah, that's right. Yes, but it won't be just loose in a baggie. It has to be a sealed container. And we have seen mock-ups of what Health Canada is proposing, and they basically look like sealed plastic bags. But the bag has to be sealed, just like a liquor bottle would have to be sealed and unopened for it to be in your vehicle or on your person. In your vehicle. But yes, that is the limit, and it matches the federal limit as well. As to detection methods, this is developing technology. It has been increasingly difficult to kind of fine-tune your drug testing equipment for one particular drug because they're all illegal. And any amount is too much. But what the government of Canada is proposing to use is something called an oral fluid drug screener. And what they are devices that are able to detect the presence of some drugs in oral fluid, including THC, which is the main component in cannabis. The device is inserted into the mouth of the driver, much like a breathalyzer. And once enough oral fluid is collected, the device indicates the presence or absence of drugs. And these devices are fast, non-invasive, and highly accurate. And oral fluid can detect THC from cannabis as well as cocaine and methamphetamine. And these are the three most common impairing drugs found in Canadian drivers. And this technology has been tested in the Northwest Territories. Yellowknife was subject to a test of this technology for the purpose of seeing cannabis. Well, cannabis can remain in your system for some time, and so a blood test would have it show up often several days after you've consumed it. But these screening devices are more immediate because they're testing the saliva that's actually in your mouth at the time. So if it was detected in your mouth with one of these devices, it would mean you had used it too recently to be in a vehicle driving. And yes, it only detects the non-impairing component. Oral fluid drug screeners do not detect non-impairing components of cannabis, and those are the components that show up in your system for a long time. So these devices are specifically designed to detect THC, which is the impairing component of cannabis. Sorry, did I miss it? Yeah, go ahead. That's a good question. We are not sure. Again, that is a question that the government or the GNWT really needs to answer, and we haven't seen that funding proposal or what the cost of equipping all detachments with this kind of technology. What we do know is that the tool is not enough. They're also relying on what are called drug recognition experts who will use their professional training to identify impaired behavior. And there are currently only a handful of those officers deployed in the Northwest Territories, around two to three, that this committee is aware of, potentially three. That's not a lot, and currently they're all in Yellowknife. So these are operational concerns that we take very seriously, and that when we do report on our findings, I expect those to be front and center, because people deserve to feel safe in their communities, and this impaired driving legislation is quite strict. It's very strong, the penalties that are being proposed, but as some of you have pointed out tonight, you need the resources to enforce those rules and those laws. So the RCMP are a key part of this regulatory regime that's being proposed by the GNWT, and this committee is taking note that there are concerns about how effective this regime will be if we don't have the right resources in place. So I hope I've been able to answer your questions. Anyone have any comments? Yes, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks for the questions, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but my understanding is that if they use the saliva test and they show that there's presence of that you've been smoking cannabis, then they would use a blood test to test the level of the active ingredient in your blood, and there's a defined limit, by just like with alcohol, same thing for the active ingredient in cannabis. I don't have the blood limits, but my colleague has them on a piece of paper there, and I think they're on the side table there. So that kind of equipment is being tested and will hopefully be ready in time, but we hear your concern. You also asked, though, about smoking with kids in a vehicle. And right now, there's nothing in legislation that stops that. here in the Northwest Territories, whether it's tobacco or whether it's cannabis. We know that one of our colleagues is interested in doing some work on that issue in terms of tobacco, but if folks believe that that should be an issue with cannabis, let us know and we can see if we can do something about the bill in that regard as well. Because right now there's nothing in here about smoking cannabis in a vehicle with children. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just add some other things. There's a lot of gray areas, as Mr. Barlock had mentioned here, which raises some questions. For example, like who's going to do the, we talked about like who's going to do the enforcement. Take some of the communities. Right off the get-go, we can't make it to all 33 communities. In the Satu, the 5 that I represent, we only went to 1. Some of the other communities, take my home community in Fort Goodhope, for example. They have no enforcement. There's no environmental health officer there. So come the legalization day, who's going to police this? The RCMP might say, well, yes, we got a contract with the JWT, but it's not in my contract. The bylaw officer might say, no, that's not my job description. So there's a number of gray areas that we have to work on as concerned parents and citizens of, and leaders of the Northwest Territories. So we just name a few, and because of the tight time frame on somebody else's legislation, we're really trying to educate, get caught up, and implement in 61 days. Thank you.
Thank you, members. So just, I do have the offense limits here, but on smoking with children in vehicles, it's correct that there's no law against doing that with tobacco. I just wanted to clarify that smoking cannabis in a vehicle while you're driving is not permitted under, or in a vehicle period, is not permitted under the legislation. It would be the same as drinking alcohol in your car. You cannot do that. So it's not explicit around children, but it would be implied that, you know, if you're lighting up in your car, that would be a problem as it relates to these new offenses. So bear with me because this might be hard to understand, but here are the legal limits that are being proposed by regulation for cannabis in your system. So at or over 2 nanograms, but under 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood for the low-level drug offense, a summary conviction offense. At over 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood for the drug alone hybrid offense, that would be a more serious offense. At over 2.5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood combined with 50 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliter of blood for the drugs with alcohol hybrid offense. And levels for some other impairing drugs will be set at any detectable level. So no matter how much is in your system, if they are detected, the offenses would apply. And this includes LSD, heroin, ketamine, PCP, and psilocybin, which is also known as mushrooms. And scientific advice indicates that any of those other drugs are incompatible with safe driving at any level. So those nanogram is a difficult measurement to understand, but so there is a limit, and they define how serious the offense is. And you know, your summary conviction would be the least severe penalty, and then they move up the ladder. And the most severe penalty is being caught impaired on alcohol and cannabis at the same time. And these are much stricter penalties than they previously were, and they can result in serious penalties as well.
It's granted again. I have 2 quick questions. The first one is a little different. Under Section 24, it talks about the minister, subject to this act, regulations and terms and conditions set out in the permit, A special occasion permit authorizes the possession, transportation, consumption of use of cannabis at a function. Has the government clarified to your committee what that means? Like, does that mean this, if a ball tournament applies and says we want, because right now you can't have cannabis at a ball diamond, and they apply, they can have somebody smoking cannabis at a ball diamond. Is that what it's aimed at? Or I don't know if that would be a question I would have for this committee to ask the government as examples of what they mean by a special occasion and that. The second thing is there's nothing in the regulations or in the acts that says, because this is all brand new, any kind of terms for a review once this legislation is put into place. I would highly, again, recommend that the committee go back to the government and have an amendment to this, to have something in there that this be, especially since it's all new to us all, and there's going to be areas that need refinement, that there should be an automatic review in there at a minimum of every 2 years, if not every year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hood. So on the special occasion permit, how that would work would be much like if you had a wedding and applied for a liquor license in a public park or something along those lines. That's how that kind of clause in this statute would affect. Now, we're not sure we have had discussions with government, and this is another one of those components of the legislation that we don't know when they plan to act on it, but it is in there for potentially the future. But yes, you're correct in that's how it would work. So basically, if you had a music festival, I think people understand how cannabis could make its way into a music festival. You could have a special permit that would allow it there, and it would still follow under some rules potentially. With we have beer gardens now in some public events. You could have a cannabis garden potentially, but again, we're not really sure how far this is going to go. And currently, the government has indicated they don't plan to go all that far with it in the current form of Bill 6. Yeah, and that would be an issue for regulations. And there's a lot of questions you may have about how this works, and in any government bill, especially bills that establishes control over a substance like cannabis, a lot of the details are going to be dealt with through regulation, which is something the government will develop after the legislation passes. So some of your questions will be answered once the regulations come forward, and we understand that many people would like to be consulted on those regulations because it's really how you make the laws work in reality, especially for community governments who will be responsible for a lot of these. So we have heard that concern, but the government has said that they will take, they'll work on the regs right away, the regulations right away, and it may be, within the first year or six months to a year that we see these things get flushed out. So with that, I'm going to call for okay. We'll hear from one more, and then we'll take a short break. If you could just introduce yourself and then proceed.
Good evening. My name is Denise McDonald, and I'm from Inuvik. My life career has been focused on education and wellness, and I'm always interested in what and how this will impact, things like this will impact our families and our young people. I see under the goals of the government, the first bullet indicates that to restrict youth access to cannabis and protect young people from promotion or enticements to use cannabis is a priority. I believe in research and education. I see you have your researcher here, but I'm also thinking that before any plebiscites are done, that our people need to get some facts in order to make an informed decision. And I think we need things like flyers with basic facts written on them, because once it's decriminalized or legalized, then it's deemed to be okay, and people think that it's okay. So I think we need more information like that. Have a researcher prepare something that can be utilized in plain language by our community people. Some of the research I've done for young people that engage in hard drugs usually started out with marijuana, cannabis. People need to know that. We need to know the costs on our healthcare system as much as possible. I don't think we're going to get any detail or accurate costs, but at least we can get a ballpark figure of what this does to our people. And I'm speaking mainly of Indigenous people to the communities that are having, our communities which have high rates of cancer and other diseases. Smoke is generally not good for the lungs, whether it's wood smoke or cigarette smoke, and cannabis smoke is hard. I've also read that there's up to 400 chemicals in cannabis. We need to know what those are, because once it's out there, and again, once it's legalized, it's going to be deemed okay to use it, and it must be okay if the government is legalizing it. So if we could just have some information like that, not only in our communities but also in our schools, I think that would be very beneficial to everyone, so that again we can make informed decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. McDonald. Your comments are noted, and we have heard that repeatedly, that public education is critical in this new regime of legalized cannabis in the Northwest Territories and in Canada. Did anyone have any comments for Ms. McDonald? Yeah. Mr. Neckmeyer?
Thank you, Ms. McDonald, for your comments. I myself, too, as an Indigenous person, I struggle through some of this. I see legislation like this. It can be successful in larger centers and larger cities, where sometimes our communities don't reach 100, so 200, 300, 500. It would be robust. I think we're going to struggle a lot before we actually start to see something like this succeed as Indigenous people. We have a lot of social ills in every community. Alcohol, drugs. Drugs are in every community, as far as I know and as far as I've heard. And I think it has a negative impact, and something I mentioned earlier, that we may hit the bottom a few more times before we start to work out the kinks and actually get data. It's going to take time for us to get hard data for something like this, something this big, something this new to everybody, and especially a lot of elders who have a lot of beliefs and are mostly against using marijuana, as they see the effect it has on some of their grandchildren. Earlier, I was going to mention also the fact that that our health system is also struggling. How do we as a region, and how do we as a health board and education board educate our children most with this? Do we utilize the greenhouses as a part of that to be educational? I think it's going to take a few more aspects from the community and a little bit more, I'd say, a little bit of brainstorming as we move forward, because this is going to move fast. And like Sunny and I, we sit down next to each other almost everywhere. We're sitting down next to each other again. We try to communicate with each other, helping our neighboring regions. And I think it's going to take a lot of that from more of our leadership all over, and we're going to have to lean on each other in some places. Getting data from other parts of the country, I think provinces like BC, Alaska is our neighbor. They have that in some of the larger cities, and as well the Indigenous people there, we could likely strike some data from it, but it's going to take some time for us to actually make headway as we step a few steps back as a community to try to look at this from a 30,000-foot level and see how we can make this work moving forward. I think we're going to struggle a little bit. It's good to educate youth, and I think the next thing is, next school year coming up, we need to really work hard this summer to ensure that our youth are aware of what the changes are, especially those younger ones getting into high school where they may not understand something this significant.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. McDonald. Pretty much every community we visited wanted more education, public education on the use, both the use of marijuana or cannabis, also plebiscites. You know, a couple communities spoke about plebiscites, and you know, in one community, one youth approached us, and we took a break and said, you know, he was kind of worried about the plebiscite because we're kind of outnumbered. He said that was last week when we were visiting, but you know, it's up to the communities, and you know, whatever the community decides for what's best for their community. You know, for sure we'll have to follow that. But you know, I just wanted to add that it's a common concern that's most likely going to be one of our recommendations. Is, you know, more public education for the communities needs to happen right away. Like it was mentioned earlier, we have kind of a target of July, so you know, I'm sure we're going to see some funding going towards this in our May-June sitting here, because they have to put some money up front to do public workshops, or you know, whether it's go to the schools or hold more meetings in the communities to educate the public, because you know, this is probably one of the most informative sessions you had in your community since all this talk has gone on, except for what you've heard on TV, or you know, it's even harder for some of the smaller communities because they were missed in the first round of consultation, and so for sure I just want to pass that on. That is one of the common concerns that we've received, and most likely be one of our top recommendations. Mrs. McDonald, sorry I got that wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. And before we break, I just wanted to point out something important with how we design these consultations. We wanted to ensure young people were consulted, and we have attended several schools, not this group, but the Southern group has attended schools and spoken to young people directly about their thoughts on this legislation and how it will affect their lives. And there is there are a couple more high schools that are going to be consulted on this. So, and that's, you know, not an endorsement of cannabis, but when we talk about legislation that is designed to protect children, and one of the policy objectives is keeping cannabis out of the hands of young people, we want to hear from young people. We've been doing whatever we can to hear directly from them, because this is the first generation of Northerners that is going to be living with legal cannabis, and that's very significant. And we want to ensure that they're respected. So I think Mr. Blake spoke to some of those concerns that we've heard, but we certainly want to hear from everyone, and young people are on our list. Oh, yeah, and we are actually meeting here with the East 3 grade 12 students on Thursday. So we'll hear from them directly. And I think all legislation, we should get the youth perspective, but this one in particular. So with that, we will take a brief break, let's say 10 minutes, and then we'll get back to any questions you may have. Thank you. We are committee in recess. I'll call committee members back to the table. We'll get started momentarily. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And committee, we are back on the clock, so we will hear from any members of the public who'd like to speak or speak again. Yes? If you could just introduce yourself before proceeding with your comments.
Thank you. My name is Sheila O'Kane, and for a day job, I work with students who are 18 years of age and over. If there's one request that I would like you to really take forward, it's to question the age limit. Now, I'm no expert, and I don't do researching as a full-time, but I listen to a lot of documentaries. And my understanding is that cannabis can have a deleterious effect on brains up until about the age 25, that the brain is still developing. Now, that's not to say that alcohol can't have a pretty serious impact on brains as well, but they tend to be short-lived. You know, if someone drinks too much and they black out, and there can be tragedies that occur during those blackouts, but you usually come out of them within 24 hours or so. But I grew up in the 60s, and so I have classmates who, were schizophrenic for life, because marijuana does seem to, and I think there are other drugs as well, but it tends to flip that schizophrenia switch, and it won't always switch back down again. I have a cousin who all his life is in a group home for schizophrenics, again, by taking too much. And I have some students that I work with now who are struggling with schizophrenia, and it was induced by too much drugging. So I think that's one thing I'd really like you to struggle with when I go back to government. And I remember the short editorial. You know, I really do believe that it was time to decriminalize the use of marijuana, but I get really upset when I hear all this talk about recreational use, because I see it as a really powerful medicine, and I think medicines need to be respected. And we don't talk about recreational use of insulin, or of aspirin, or of penicillin. The hemp plant, I think, has a lot of benefits. Everything from making paper and cloth to nutritional value and also a medicinal component. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have heard, obviously, about the age limit that's being proposed of 19 years, and there is medical research out there that shows that there can be impacts of cannabis on brain development up to the age of 25, as you mentioned. So committee is aware of these facts. The policy impetus for setting the age at 19, and it's actually lower in the federal in the criminal code. I think it's 18 in the federal legislation. So the reason for that is that the government of Canada produced that number is the rates of cannabis abuse amongst young people in Canada is very, very high. It's the highest in the world. Or at least the developed world that we know about from the numbers that are coming out. Around 63% of young people have consumed cannabis at one time in their lives. And the current system of prohibition does not seek taking cannabis out of the hands of children and young people. And the concern about placing the age restriction too high is it will not, it may not have the desired results on limiting the black market that is already has generous access from youth. So it isn't an effort to regulate it and control it and to prevent further black market sales of cannabis products to young people. Because right now there's nothing preventing a drug dealer from purveying their product to young people. Now, the health effects are, of course, a concern to any people who are working on designing a cannabis system. Different provinces have chosen different ages, and the GNWT chose 19 to keep it in parity with the age of legal drinking. And the hope there is we will see less black market sales of cannabis products. But yeah, and it's hard to it's hard for governments to educate people on a prohibited substance. It's hard for anyone to really say this is how to consume a product responsibly when it is illegal to do so. So another advantage to full legalization is the ability to have those conversations with young people and to design public education materials to indicate what the effects are if consumed. And we do that with alcohol now. We do that with tobacco products now, and it's we've heard that as well, that alcohol is a serious problem in the Northwest Territories, and what do we really want more addictive substances? And that is a concern. But again, this all stems from not a desire to make money off cannabis. This is about trying to better control a substance that is widespread in our society and fine-tuning our own territorial system of controls to work within that system. And I know it is certainly controversial in many communities, and that's why we're here to hear from you. So all I'm trying to provide now is not to argue with your points, but to give you some sense of where this legislation comes from, and to clarify some policy objectives of decision makers, both in Ottawa and in our own government. Go ahead, please.
No, just the comment. I agree. I don't think it should not be a goal to make money off of this this legislation. I hate to see it being touted as a new economic opportunity.
And thank you. And of course, medicinal cannabis products are currently legal in Canada with a doctor's prescription, and that is unchanged. So even that's a federally regulated system of medicinal cannabis, and there are no changes being proposed to that system. So we'll still operate the same way. And another committee that I sit on, the Economic Development Committee, were able to speak to one of the large growers of medical marijuana or medical cannabis in Edmonton last year, and we learned that they're able to fine-tune strains of cannabis products and actually cultivate out the THC. So it's only the medicinal properties that remain in that cannabis product. So it is possible to again cultivate certain strains that do different things, and to create purely medicinal, non-narcotic versions of cannabis. So this is the medical. Since medical cannabis was legalized, there's been a lot of development in not only our understanding of how it affects the human body, but what we can actually do to create safer cannabis for medical patients, for example. But again, this legislation is primarily designed to address criminality around a controlled substance, and of course the recreational use of cannabis, which is of course widespread in Canada. But it is. But thank you for your comments. If I could ask you just one question, what would you prefer the age of use to be, the legal limit?
Well, I don't have a preference, but what I hear is that up until about age 25, the brain is still developing and it's still very sensitive to it, or more sensitive to it than it is after.
Thank you. Any other committee members wish to comment? Okay. Thank you. Yep, please.
Okay. Consuming cannabis is I don't consume, sorry. My name is Nikki. I work at the drugstore. I'm from Inuvik. I've been here since. Anyway, I'm from here. I love it here. I want to continue staying here. But with legalization, it's kind of, well, anyway. So, consuming cannabis, would territorial parks be counted as a public space? So does that mean I'm in a camp or in a park and I'm camping and I see someone smoking? It's a public space. I don't have kids with me and there's no crowd, but I see someone consuming. So does that mean I can call the RCMP and say, hey, you're smoking in a public space? It's not specific here, or would there be a specific thing somewhere? Because the GNW has territorial parks, community parks, and everything else. And then there's another one here for consumption too, about, oh, yeah, and would there be, oh yes, about secondhand exposure. Since a territorial park is open space, so they can't, oh, thanks Sheila. Would secondhand smoke come into this, or what's the, there's no legislation, I can't read it in the bill, so. And of course, it's July is the deadline. July is summer, tourists come, and they come from different provinces, and there would be different age limits for each province. So do I ask, hey, where are you from? Are you 18 years old and do you have marijuana with you? Or am I not allowed to do that? Or who is allowed to do that? Like ask tourists in a public space. And you are in the GNWP in a territorial park or campground in your own trailer. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. So the age in the Northwest Territories, as being proposed, is 19. So even if it's 18 in Alberta, for example, it doesn't matter. Once you cross over the border, that's the age. It's just like alcohol. Whatever the limit is in that jurisdiction is what applies. Who will enforce it? Good question. The minister has the power to designate inspectors under the Act for both the Cannabis Control Act, which is the retail and consumption side of things, and also inspectors for the purpose of the Smoking Control Act. We heard earlier that environmental health officers who are employees of the Department of Health and Social Services would be have been identified as one of those classes of inspectors, and for smoking control. And so, to your question of who would enforce smoking restrictions, it would currently the GNWT is proposing their environmental health officers, and that and as was pointed out as well, there are 7 of those in the territory. So that is resourcing that is a concern, and we have noted that. As for a territorial park, I'm just going to read in the bill on page 39. There is a list of definitions as they are interpreted under the Cannabis Smoking Control Act. Public place means all the following, means all or any part of a building, structure, or facility, whether covered by a roof or not, to which the public has access as of right or by express or implied invitation, including the buildings and grounds of a school as defined in subsection 1 of the Education Act, a facility as defined in the Hospital Insurance and Health and Social Services Administration Act, an outdoor bus shelter, a building, structure, or facility, or any part of a building, structure, or facility that is used for private events, a building, structure, or facility, or any part of a building, structure, or facility that is owned or leased by a private club, that restricts admission to members and guests, and a building, structure, facility, or place that is prescribed specifically or by class. And that means that regulations that can come out of this legislation could further describe classes. So it's unclear to the committee at this point if public place applies to a territorial park. So that is clarification that we will seek to obtain out of these consultations. But as there is broad regulation-making authority granted to the minister under this legislation, presumably that would be something that could be brought forward after on. And yeah, the regulations you'll find on page 45, and I won't go into them. It's sufficient to say the minister does have the authority to designate territorial parks as smoke-free. Now, if that's something that is a concern, that could be put directly into legislation, because currently I can't say with certainty that territorial parks will be covered. That is a question for the government and the minister responsible. And as for the effects of secondhand smoke, obviously there needs to be more health. The health impacts of cannabis are relatively unknown. We know some research has been done, but how secondhand smoke in particular affects people, that's still more work needs to be done on that. More work needs to be done on all the public health outcomes, and research needs to be put in place to that effect. And we're hoping to see funding from both the federal government, but from all governments in Canada, working collaboratively to understand the effects of cannabis on the human brain, on the human body, and in particular the consequences of secondhand smoke in the home towards children. So that is something that we've heard. Could you just get up to the mic? That's all right.
But it's established medical fact that secondhand smoking from tobacco causes cancer. So, ergo, but of course, scientific studies haven't shown anything about cannabis secondhand smoke yet. But smoking per se has the same substances. They all have the same substances. Carbon monoxide, all the bad, effects are, because you haven't even touched on what kind of cannabis will be provided in the store yet. So we don't know yet what kind of secondhand smoke chemicals and secondary substances will come out of that. So, but since you're doing the education thing too, it's best that secondhand smoke, tobacco or not, is still the leading cause of cancer. Is still a leading cause of cancer. So maybe more research, yes, of course, is welcome. You can have a lot of research done by high school students or whatever to promote it, to like, hey guys, you are the next taxpayers. So maybe if you become healthy in the future, you can help us old people. And that's my thing about cannabis legislation, because I feel like, yes, legalization, decriminalization is good for the youth, because no repeat offenders or whatever, but I'm also thinking about our future and their future. So if we're exposing them to secondhand smoke and their brains are dysfunctioning and high functioning still, and they're exposed, and then we lead them to health concerns while they're in their 30s and 40s. So when we are in our 60s and 70s, who will take care of us? So maybe put that in your mind too. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. So one thing, because I know a lot of parents are concerned about this and are listening tonight, and although the legislation does allow smoking in on your private property, which would include in your home. Committee has learned the committee has learned that the process that triggers a social services complaint would be seeing evidence of alcohol in the home around youth, and that's what, even though alcohol is legal and it's legal to drink in your home, if you're not using it responsible and your children are being exposed to it, that could result in a social services investigation. And the same would apply to cannabis, even if legal. That if there are cannabis products easily accessible to children or evidence of smoking at the home, social services could be involved. And the legislation, although it's not directly in this bill, the director of social services has the power to bring forward new regulations called directives that could address that. So we've noted that, and we're going to ask that question and put it in, or ask that question and clarify the position. But our understanding as a committee is that the government already has the authority under the social services directives to address smoking cannabis around children. So hopefully that puts people's minds at ease. Yes, Mayor McDonald, you wanted to speak? Yeah. Okay. Okay, just introduce yourself and then you can proceed.
Hi, I'm Steve Krug. As a new parent, I'm just curious as to the safeguards to the distribution and sales, including mail orders. In Section 3, number 10, it says the subject of the regulations, a vendor may mail or otherwise deliver cannabis to a person who has purchased it from the vendor. Well, my 10-year-old knows how to order stuff from Amazon and eBay, so what's going to stop him or her from maybe experimenting when she's older as a teenager to buy marijuana or cannabis or other things from eBay that show up on my credit card? Also, you had made a mention regarding a pilot project for the saliva tests in Yellowknife. Is there an outcome of that study available for public viewing?
Yes, so to the, I'll try to do my best to address both. So when they tested the oral fluid drug screening devices in it ended in March of 2017. And what the federal government has said at this point is the pilot project documented the experiences and feedback from officers who participated in the project, and the project will help inform the development of national standards and ensure a comprehensive approach to the use of drug screening devices in the enforcement of drug-impaired driving in Canada for specific classes of drugs. The pilot ended in March 2017, and results will be made public in the coming weeks. And this was published. I'm not sure when this was published, so maybe that information is again, this is the federal government, not the GNWT. So we'll look into that though and see.
When you mentioned officers, were the officers actually consuming the cannabis, or were these subjects that were identified from the public?
No. So how it worked, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that they would, if they pulled someone over, they would ask them a question: have you consumed cannabis? And and would tell them you will not be prosecuted. And if people disclosed they did, they would test the device on them and then record the results. So it's kind of an opt-in for people who are impaired behind the wheel on cannabis, and that's what informed their experience. Although if they identified it through drug recognition techniques, they could also test it then. So it wasn't on the police weren't experimenting, shall we say. It was in the course of their normal traffic stops. They were deploying this technology and seeing how it actually used. So it was used on people who were suspected of drug impairment, and not just cannabis, any kind of drug impairment.
So they got a free pass?
More or less. Again, not responsible for those details, and we don't have too many of them, but that information may be available online. This is from Justice Canada. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this or any other information about the federal government's legislation to visit www.justice.gc.ca, and you'll find more information there. You were concerned about the mail order system for cannabis. How that actually will work in practice, again, is a matter for the government to develop, and we hope that they will do so in consultation with communities and with concerned parents like yourself. What is being proposed for sale at these stores is dried cannabis, so not, that gets into a bit of Nikki's question as well, not a process like a cigarette is processed and there's many chemicals in there. You can also buy just raw tobacco and roll your own cigarettes. So what's largely being contemplated for cannabis products is dried cannabis. And we have seen some mock-ups of what Health Canada is regulating as packaging for that product. So you get your whatever amount you'd want sent to you in a packaging with warning labels on it. And how you register for it, whether or not, I mean, that is, again, I can't answer how they're going to restrict youth getting into that system. But currently, mail order liquor is a possibility through the Liquor Commission in communities without a liquor store. So I don't think in your case in Inuvik, if there was a local cannabis store, there would be mail order from the Liquor Commission because they would direct people to go there. There are, as everyone knows, there's a thriving gray market in Canada of online sales. You can order with impunity currently over the internet. And this legislation and legalization in general, and this legislation in particular, is trying to prevent that practice from continuing. So if someone who's a legal producer and seller of cannabis sells to people in the Northwest Territories after legalization and after the Liquor Commission is set up, the government has said that anyone who doesn't use the Liquor Commission would have their federal license revoked. So that is how the government is proposing to use what this legislation we're talking about today to prevent online sales into communities outside of the Liquor Commission. So again, registering for or making sure that only people who should have cannabis products receive it. We'll have to see what the regulations are brought out.
Do you mind if I ask one more question?
Yeah, please.
Between the Justice Minister and the Minister of Finance, have they thought of separating the cannabis sales from the liquor sales to make an autonomous department in the government so that the liquor sales are separate from the cannabis sales, as a lot of lottery sales are directed to sports and rec funding and other things across the board? In the future, would those things be considered for cannabis going towards, like a lot of people have mentioned, for education, infrastructure, and things like that, to be able to make a separate pot of money right off the get-go instead of a revolving fund of in and out, where they could actually track and base the initial revenue from the first year of inception of legalization?
Your suggestion is noted. I mean, we can't speak for either minister. But that is we've heard a lot about, and in fact, you're not the first person to bring that up tonight, about defining what we call in policy development is defining a revenue stream. So to have a defined revenue stream for where things are spent. And I'll give you an example of this. Recently, the Legislative Assembly passed a revolving fund bill around the marine transportation services. So that used to be NTCL, and now the government owns those assets. So all the money generated by the marine operation stays with the marine operation and is used for maintenance of those assets and the operations of the marine transportation. So it's possible to do this with legislation, and we've heard this enough to have started the discussion internally on how to best go about defining a revenue stream for cannabis. So we ensure that the money is being used for a purpose and not just going back into general revenue, where it gets mixed in with everything else. I've been speaking for a while, and I'd like to give my colleagues a chance if they would like to speak to any of the points raised by the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Blake. So, Mr. Blake just raised one of the policy pieces that was agreed to at the national level is to ensure that where a liquor store is selling cannabis product, that the cannabis side be separated from the liquor side, so separate doors. So what the government's proposing to do is where a liquor store sells cannabis products, that there be two separate entrances. So there'd be your cannabis store and your liquor door. So that would be, and the idea behind that is it's not just you can't just go to the counter, pick all your intoxicants and leave. You have to make those separate trips, but obviously in practice we have yet to see how that works. But that is something the government's proposing to do. Mayor McDonald, you had to. Oh, okay. Please come on up.
Good evening. My name is Joe LeBoy. I'm a town councillor as well as a business person in Inuvik. I'd like to. Okay, get right up close. Thank you. Joe LeBoy, town councillor and business person in Inuvik. I'd like to thank the committee for coming to Inuvik to allow us to express our thoughts and concerns regarding this matter. One of the concerns I have is more on the business side, is the liability issues that might exist in regards to employees that might be under the influence of cannabis. It's difficult to monitor everybody at a work site. I just wondered what the government's approach would be in regards to that, what type of liability might still rest on the shoulders of the business if an incident occurred where a dangerous incident occurred where somebody was seriously injured, and what the consequences of that might be. My son happened to have a job a number of years ago in the oil industry in Alberta, and while he was there, I asked him, I said, son, a lot of guys smoke up because they have a zero tolerance. And he says, Dad, everybody's doing it. It's unbelievable. I said, well, what does the supervisor say? Well, he's with the guys. They're having a toke. And so I was wondering, well, how do they get away with that? And then months later, I happened to be at a social event and talking to a lady that was sitting at a table with us, and she owned a convenience store in Bonnie. Well, it was in Alberta. I won't mention the community, but she said she had a convenience store, and I asked her which one, and it was off the beaten track. I said, well, I've never noticed your convenience store. What's your number one seller? What do you sell there? And she says, well, I sell, this little product. I don't know what it was called. I don't recall the name, but it was a little shot of something. And she said, yeah, I sell about 1,000 of those a day, $10 a shot. Oh, well, what does that do? She says it masks marijuana. So, anyways, that's some of the concerns I have, and like I said, it could be very serious. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. LeBoy. And this is you'll note that this is not a part of the bill or workplace issues, and the reason for that is the again, Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission already the rules under that legislation, you can't be impaired on the job site currently. So there's no changes required at that level. But the committee has spoken to representatives from the WSCC, and they have indicated they're currently working on policy to give employers guidance on cannabis issues. And I'm going to speak personally on this and allow any other members to do so. But I mean, if we think about cigarettes and how we've seen a huge drop-off in cigarette smoking, especially amongst young people, and largely that is there's better quality public health information available to people to make informed choices. And when something is illegal and the only choice is don't do it because it's illegal and you may go to jail, it's harder to have an informed conversation. And my hope with the advent of legalized cannabis and legalized recreational use is that people will make better choices and understand that I'm going to work, I can wait to use cannabis. Whereas currently, you know, if you get busted, you get busted. It doesn't matter where you are, what time of day it is. And, you know, it wasn't that long that I was in university and before that high school, and I knew friends who would drive their vehicles impaired on cannabis, and we thought nothing of it because that person was a stoner and they were high all the time, so you can't really talk to them about it. And I would have never gone into a vehicle with someone who was swigging a Mickey behind the wheel and driving drunk. I wouldn't have done it. But with cannabis, I just shrugged my shoulders, and that was, you know, bad on my part. So I think we all, there's 2 points here, you know, recognizing where we're at with the substance in Canada and how widespread the usage is, and trying to come to grips with it. But I think we'll see better quality information available to people, and they'll make smarter decisions like they do around cigarettes and alcohol usage for the most part. Obviously, we still have problems with those substances, but we have a problem with cannabis, and legalizing isn't going to make it go away, but it could make it better, and that's my hope at the end of the day. But that is reflective of my experience, not the committee's. So I'll allow committee members to speak to this if they choose. Mr. McNeely?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Joe, there for those comments there. I think it's one of those situations where we can all admit that this product is with our society today and has been for a number of decades. And through education, I think we can acknowledge what our chair is saying to minimize that. Hopefully that we have more education workshops, and that will help to share the bad side of this product. But I wanted to go back. We heard a number of times on the mail order system. And I would say what committee is mandated to do now is listen to the concerns, and we heard mail order allowances and how to have some conditions on that. We can take the mail order provision in this clause, incorporate a clause into the existing document, and have conditions saying, yes, you can have a mail order system. However, there's conditions attached to that application for a mail order, such as legal age identification. So I guess that would be an example of how to take that concern on mail order and incorporate that into Bill 6. Thank you.
Mr. Nekmayak?
Thank you. Thanks, Joey, for that. Getting back to the workplace policy, I think that's something that, as a business owner, that you may have to look at. That's something that the town of Inuvik may have to look at as well, too. Maybe they're, I know, working with projects around the territory and around Canada. A fitness for duty policy may have to be put in place for to ensure that you're abiding by the rules. Also the liabilities with workers' compensation and other insurers may be a huge risk, and that may bring the cost of doing business up. Also, another question is, who pays for this? Does this go to a department like ITI or other departments within the territory? There's Ondo government that may be able to assist. Maybe that's something that needs to be recommended. Also, retaining employees. If you have a drug test policy within your company or within the community, it may be hard to retain part-time employees. I know full-time employees definitely make a commitment to their workplace, and those are the ones that you can trust and count on all the time. Fitness for duty is something that may have to happen. I know from a liability standpoint, I would definitely want to ensure that the people that are working for me or the organization that I represent, show their professionalism inside and outside of work too. But there are a lot of things that we don't have control over in life, and this is one of them that may be a huge risk, mainly to the business owners in the community.
Thank you, members, and thank you again, Mr. LeBoy. Mr. Mayor?
Good evening there, and I'd like first to thank you all for coming up, giving the community and the people an opportunity to voice their opinions and hopefully get some input that you can take back to the House and make some positive changes. I came more tonight to listen to the concerns from the community, but I'd also like to make a couple of comments, I guess. I know it's been mentioned before, the legislation, or the federal legislation, was dropped on us or imposed upon us, and we weren't really given much of a timeline to implement legislations in the territory. So I don't believe that, you know, we'll get the legislation will be perfect, but I think we have to realize that it can be changed, and I think you need to be prepared to react and change the legislation as it comes up, that we can see where it needs improvements, needs changes. I think you need to be aggressive on moving to implement those changes as they arise. And I think you know, a good starting point, as brought forward earlier, is to do a regular review of the legislation to ensure that it's meeting the needs and the concerns of the people of the North. And as far as enforcement of the regulations, I believe if it's a criminal offense, that would fall, and I think it's the responsibility of the RCMP to enforce the criminal side of the legislation. As a community, I know Inuvik is certainly better prepared than a lot of the other smaller communities, but we certainly don't have the resources to enforce. I don't believe we have, or I know we don't have the resources to enforce this legislation. So I think if it's illegal and a criminal, I think that would have to come under the RCMP's jurisdiction. Our bylaw enforcement, or our enforcement officers, are here to enforce municipal bylaws that we recreate, and we will have some ability to create bylaws regarding cannabis within the community that we may, or we would more than likely enforce within the community. But certainly I think the legislation itself doesn't fall within the municipal boundaries or municipal enforcement options, right? So anyways, once again, thanks for coming up, giving us the opportunity to raise our concerns, and we hope that we can move forward with this. And like I said, I don't believe we'll have all of our bases covered, but I think we need to be prepared to make the changes to do that as they arise and as we recognize them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Akamaic.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't know if this is a question or not, but like as you mentioned, the Inuvik as a regional center is more prepared, but yet this year we'll likely see the brunt of it in this part of the region. I'm just asking, my question to you is, working together, I mentioned earlier, the RCMP are definitely on top of this, and their line of training, they'll keep close to them until it moves further ahead. And I'm just wondering if the town has struck up a joint committee from different organizations in the community to help move forward with this, so that as it gets towards moving into force. That might be one of the topics of your next meeting, as well as the IRC or the Gutchin or other entities in the community, as well as government departments, and maybe leads from key government departments to help, so that everybody's on track, and also to reduce the amount of liabilities within each one, so that you're working within your margins.
Go ahead, Mayor McDonald.
Okay. At this stage, we haven't had any community engagement. We were waiting first to get better understand or look at the legislation. When this opportunity came up, then we decided after this we would, after this with the consultation here, we would then look at our options on how we're going to proceed with community engagement and where we would go from there. So we will be having some community discussion and getting reaching out to get more input from the community as well. So,
thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thanks. And as you know, as this is the first day of our tour going into, we're going to Inuvik and Tuktiaktuk, which are two communities in my region. I think we'll be happy to share what we learned from them as well too, so that we get another perspective from outside the community, with Inuvik being the regional center.
Go ahead, Mr.
And I think it's going to depend a bit, or a lot, I think, on getting a clear or clearly defining some of that legislation, like the one with public consumption. There's a bit of gray area there yet. The way I read it, it bans the use of marijuana in public places, but it still appears, we're still talking about limiting around parks and stuff, but I think in open spaces where public has access, it's a public place and it should be banned, right? I think if you're trying to limit it to certain areas, specific areas in the community, it's only going to get that much harder to enforce, right? And I think it'll, as the liquor laws, even as they are, the liquor laws are written where there is no consumption in public places or spaces. I'm sure you know how hard that is to enforce already, right? And so I think marijuana would be similar, but if you're trying to target specific areas, then it makes it that much harder to enforce, right? So, but I think it's going to come to getting more familiar with the legislation, I guess, once it's implemented. And that's why I think we need to be prepared to change and adapt and change the legislation as we come to better understand and these issues or problems become clearer, right? Be able to change the legislation to correct the shortfalls or deficiencies in the legislation. So,
thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any other questions or comments? I think so. Any other comments from or questions from the audience? Everyone understands Bill 6 perfectly then? No. Well, with that, we will we'll conclude the public portion of this meeting. Our committee will go in camera afterwards and just discuss what we heard, and then we'll break for the night. But before we end the public portion, I'll just allow committee members to say any closing comments that they may have. We'll start with Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. I want to thank the mayor for his comments and questions. That they're ones that I've been thinking about as well. I served 9 years on city council in Yellowknife, so that's sort of still near and dear to my heart. On Thursday night, we have a public meeting much like this in Yellowknife, so I expect we're probably going to hear some of the same issues there. But I want to thank the mayor and everybody that came out this evening and shared your comments, concerns, and issues. And I know I've been taking careful notes, and I know our staff have as well, and all the committee members, and we're going to try to reflect those issues in our report. But as the mayor said, we may not get this right even at the beginning, but I think it is important to make sure that we can adapt and learn from our experiences and make improvements as we go along. But thanks very much for having us in your community and the feedback that you gave us this evening. It's very valuable to us. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I do want to thank the leaders for this afternoon's meeting and this evening, and for the public coming out. The more you give us, the more information we gather and include in our report, which is good. And of course, you can see some of the challenges we have. We never went to all 33 communities. I know I'm going to have to do some more visiting in the other 4 Sault communities that we couldn't make it to. But I want to thank you, and rest assured that your concerns are noted, and I look forward to incorporating those concerns into the document. Thank you.
Mr. Blake?
Thank you for coming out, everyone. Also to the mayor and SAO and councillors for meeting us this afternoon, and also coming this evening. It shows that you're really concerned for the community, impacts this will have. A lot of good questions this evening. We'll be for sure reviewing everything. Some of the similar concerns to other communities, but you know, that shows that everybody's has the same concerns for their communities, and you know, this is a real learning process for us all here. And you know, for sure we have to be open-minded to make changes here in the near future. You know, for our colleagues to say that for now this is how it's going to be. Well, you know, it's pretty tough to say that because we don't know what the outcome's going to be. We have to be open and ready to make changes as needed. And moving forward, I believe that's what we have to do here. But I'd like to thank you all for coming out, asking your questions. I hope we answered it to the best of our ability. Like I said a little earlier, we kind of have to watch how we answer your questions, because we can't make any commitments for cabinet. And you know, but working together, I'm hoping that we could make things a little easier for communities. For sure, we're always concerned about our youth, and you know, we have to limit the impacts on them here. Just like to thank you all once again, and just pass it on to my colleague here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for everybody coming out. It was nice to hear your concerns and some ideas as well too. Some of the issues from the pharmacy, from teachers, from business owners, and people alike. My apologies when I said joint committee. I didn't mean that. I meant committee of the region of the community. And I know it's recorded, but still, as being an MLA from this region, I'm definitely open to working with anybody and everybody. We don't really do work in the territory. We do it nationally. We do it internationally. So every time we have an opportunity to help in whatever way we can to help understand something or to move something, or so when we have a question that's unclear, or a lot with health, a lot with environment, something like this will have impacts on everything down the road, and especially our children who don't really have a voice right now. So I'm open to chatting with anybody anytime. Not shy to answer honestly on anything. So feel free to make a phone call to our office, or send an email, or just say hi sometimes at the airport or wherever it may be. But thanks again. The input tonight was really actually very, very useful, and I look forward to hearing back from community members again. So thanks.
Thank you, members. So that brings the public portion of this meeting to a conclusion, and I too, on behalf of the committee, would like to thank everyone for making us so welcome in your community. It's great being back in Inuvik, and we're here for the next couple of days as our base of operations as we reach out to other communities in the region. But I couldn't imagine a better place to be this beautiful time of year. And I really want to thank everyone who came out today and approached this topic with maturity, sensitivity, and a good sense of humor, because this is the most significant piece of legislation that we're probably going to deal with as the 18th Legislative Assembly. It affects our culture, it affects our criminal justice system, and it affects our economy, and every community is affected. So we are taking this very seriously, and we're making use of every moment of our time to better understand how this will affect people, and to make a product at the end of the day that can be workable on day one. Any piece of legislation may change. Sometimes it takes a long time in our system of government. So we want to make sure that we can make this the best bill it can be on day one, and a bill that works for communities and not against the interests of communities. And that takes some careful balancing of priorities. And we're going to work very hard and very diligently to ensure that the final product reflects that. So if you have any further thoughts on Bill 6, please provide them to the Standing Committee before Friday, May 4th at 5 p.m. And you can find our contact information at assembly.gov.nt.ca. And there's some handouts that have all that contact information as well. We'd love to hear from you. I know this is a lot of information tonight. Even if you have other additional questions that we weren't able to get to, please get in touch with the committee, and we'll do our best to answer them. And with that, thank you very much. We'll take a brief break, and then we'll go in camera committee. So again, thank you very much for coming out tonight. Committee, we're on recess.